Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started here shortly. We're just going to take another minute or so just to let people get into the Zoom, and then we will get going because I know there will likely be a lot of questions for us on this one. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the third installation of the Rockefeller College Spring Lunch and Learn series. This is an event sponsored by Rockefeller College, organized by our staff. The intention of this series is to highlight the expertise of our faculty, not just our research, but how the research we do affects society and speaks to the most important issues in the country and the world today. And we hope to educate the audience and our community, and also just have a space where people can ask us questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. And if we don't know, we'll tell you we don't know. I am Julie Novkov. I am the Dean of Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy, but I'm also a political scientist with expertise in law. And I'm joined today by Professor Rob Worden of the School of Criminal Justice. So just a few quick ground rules for today's presentation. Please do remain muted so that your mic doesn't pick up ambient noise. Each of us will speak for a little while to give you our perspective on what's happening from our areas of expertise. And once we've completed our opening remarks, we would welcome your questions. You can use the raise hand function if you would like to just say your question, or you can put it in the chat and I can pick it up there. If you would like to send it to me privately, if you would not want to be identified, you can certainly do that as well. And I will read the question aloud to the audience. We had a couple questions come in advance, so we won't handle those as well as much as we can. So in addition to being the host today, I am one of the presenters. So what I'm going to do is just give you a brief sense of the institutional structure we're dealing with here with regard to the Minnesota situation and other situations that have evolved. Then I will talk a little bit about just what has happened, what the timeline has been, and then I will talk about the federal legal background to what is happening with ICE and CBP, and also the deployment of federal guard and military in support of these operations and how that plays in with American law. So first, just a little bit on the structure, the institutional structure of what's happening right now. I'm going to share my screen just to inflict one slide on you that I think will be a little bit helpful. So here we go. You should be able to see this, and I will do it so that you can see it hopefully pretty well. So this is the organizational structure for how these operations are taking place. The Department of Homeland Security is a relatively new government institution. It was founded in 2003 as a response to the September 11th attacks and a need for better coordination on these issues. And it pulled together offices that had previously been spread across several different government agencies. So some from Treasury, some from Justice, some from really a bunch of different agencies. It's important for our purposes to note that INS is within the Department of Homeland Security now, and that sector it includes 4 organizations. So directly under Homeland Security and under the direction of Kristi Noem, we have Immigration and Customs Enforcement. This is ICE, of course. We have Customs and Border Protection, CBP. Apologies for reversing the letters there. We also have Citizenship Immigration Services, and then FEMA is part of this chain as well. I won't be talking about FEMA today, but I think it's useful to know that they are part of that particular cluster within Homeland Security. But one other thing I wanted to note is that a couple of people have been involved in immigration and deportation who are not in that chain of administrative structure. So we have Tom Homan, who's been declared a border czar and reports directly to President Trump. And then there's a good deal of information suggesting that Homeland Security Advisor Stephen Miller, who's a deputy chief of staff in the White House, is driving a lot of the decisions, both about the broad policy aims here and how mass deportation is actually going to be implemented. So it's important to keep them in mind as well when you're thinking about what is happening and who's making these calls.
Julie, I'm sorry to interrupt. We can't see your slide.
You cannot see it?
No.
Oh gosh, I'm so sorry.
No, it's okay.
Let me just try that again. Are you seeing it now?
Yes, now we can see it.
Okay, I'm so very sorry about that. Thanks for letting me know.
Yes.
So just again, here you have the regular chain of command with Homeland Security. Note that that's sort of a traditional government operation with the cabinet head reporting to Trump. In this case, it is Kristi Noem. And then she has direct reports from those four sub-agencies. And then outside of that structure, you have Homan and Miller and their reporting structure directly to the president. And all of these folks have a say on how mass deportation is being driven at both at the 30,000 foot level and on ground. So, okay, I will now stop the sharing my screen, which hopefully I have done. Yes. Okay, good. All right, so back to the presentation here. So DHS, again, ICE has is under DHS, but its mission formed in 2002 and greatly expanded under Trump has been to stop, detain, and arrest individuals who are suspected of being in the United States illegally. Now, ICE is required to have a judicial warrant to enter a home or private space, but they have a lot of authority to go after individuals suspected of being in the U.S. illegally beyond that. They do have a limited power to detain U.S. citizens if those citizens are interfering with arrests or if they are assaulting officers. Border Patrol is, again, a separate institution with a separate mission. They are obviously responsible for securing the border. And they have an expanded authority to conduct searches if those searches are taking place within 100 miles of the border. Now, that may sound rather narrow, but a great proportion of the US population actually lives within 100 miles of the border. And the Trump administration has also kind of redefined how we think about the border so that it starts at the edge of the Great Lakes rather than in the middle, which encompasses cities like Chicago. When Trump came into office, one of the first things that he did was declare a national emergency on the border. And this triggered the authorization of more discretion to the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security. And what we've seen since then is a rapid use of these forces to enforce this mission of mass deportation, and also a use of other backup forces to try to push this along. I'm just going to walk through the development of this process as it has unfolded. There have been a number of domestic military deployments ordered to cities, generally cities often in blue states, but not always, but cities that are led by members of the Democratic Party. So we saw that take place in June in 2025, took place in DC in August of 2025, in Memphis in September of 2025, And then the National Guard was called up in Portland in September for deployment to Chicago in October and for deployment to New Orleans in December. But there were some court cases that I'll talk about a little bit later, and not all of these deployments happened in the way that the administration had wanted them to. And the deployments that were ordered for Los Angeles, Chicago, and Portland were terminated in December of 2025. These operations have led to significant violence. In addition to the very well publicized killings of Renee Good and Alex Pretty, there were 2 additional deadly shootings of non-citizens that took place in the line of duty. There was another off-duty deadly shooting, and then there have been 5 non-deadly shootings in connection to immigration enforcement actions nationally. With respect to Minnesota, DHS announced this operation on December 4th and began a very aggressive enforcement campaign, which triggered a reaction from the people in Minneapolis and St. Paul. They launched a system whereby people on the scene were using whistles to alert other individuals that ICE was on the scene, and they were using cell phones to record these operations as they were taking place. The enforcement action led to the detention of some of these observers and the detention of many undocumented or suspected undocumented immigrants, many of whom were sent to Texas. This became more heated in January, with the administration calling up 2,000 additional agents and sending them to Minneapolis, St. Paul. The shooting of Renee Good took place on January 7th. And then you just see this getting to be increasingly confrontational, with federal agents using chemical irritants in a variety of settings, including outside schools. And many allegations of a non-proportional violence being used against protesters. There were mass protests taking place in early January, and additional detentions, additional arrests of observers and citizens that were alleged to be quite violent, along with allegations of conditions in the Whipple building where people were being detained being rather bad. Alex Pretty had his first confrontation with ICE on January 11th. If we look at the video from that confrontation, he appears to spit on the window of a vehicle and then to kick at the tail light and damage it. He was tackled at the time by several ICE officers, but not arrested. These protests continue into the next week. And then you have these 2 fairly significant events. One, the detention of the 5-year-old Liam Conejo Ramos on January 20th, the declaration of a general strike in Minnesota on January 23rd, and then Pretty's killing on January 24th. Everyone, I'm sure, has followed the media firestorm around these events. One effect was that the Trump administration made some noises about changing the operation, putting it under different leadership. Bovino was removed from the scene, and Homan was announced as the new director of operations in Minnesota. And that is more or less where we stand right now. Reports are fairly conflicting. You see the administration talking about drawing down forces and behaving in a different way. People on the scene are saying that this is not really, in fact, happening, and that the detentions are continuing, and that the federal officers on the scene are continuing to push back against individuals who are protesting, who are recording what is going on, and who are attempting to alert targets, either specific targets or general targets of these operations, that they are ongoing. So I wanted to talk just a bit about the broad legal framework for what is going on. This falls into a couple of different categories, sort of what can federal officers do when they are enforcing immigration law, and then how does that play in with our system of federalism, where we presume that the everyday enforcement of the laws is often on the state level and under the management of state officials. There has been some recent controversy over the actions of federal officers and their lack of use of proper warrants. There was a recently released memo from DHS purporting to exempt officials from warrant requirements to enter homes. And then there's been some discussion within the administration of basically engaging in profiling to stop and detain people without any probable cause other than that they appear to be Mexican, Central American, South American. That was sort of given a little bit of a blessing of approval by a Supreme Court emergency docket case, which Kavanaugh in particular has tried to walk back a little bit since. But there's some big federalism and civil military relations concerns in play here as well. When can the federal government demand state assistance, and when can the federal government use the military to enforce the law or suppress dissent? This goes back to some significant statutory structures that have been in place for quite some time. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 and the Insurrection Act, which goes all the way back to 1807. Posse Comitatus was passed in 1878. If you are a history buff, you might recognize that as being near the time that federally imposed Reconstruction ended. It generally forbids the use of federal troops for civilian law enforcement unless there is a specific congressional statute that authorizes it. Some legislation passed since then has made it very clear that express authorization is required for this. And there are probably about 20 different circumstances in which it can happen. So disasters, specific threats to federal property, some forms of civil disorder, and it covers all federal troops, but not state National Guard units unless those Guard units are themselves federalized. The Insurrection Act of 1807 is somewhat narrow in the circumstances in which it can be used. One is if a state governor or legislature requests federal backup to enforce the law, then the president can order troops in. When, quote, unlawful obstructions, combinations, assemblages, or rebellion, unquote, thwart the enforcement of federal law, and this is a very high bar. And then insurrection itself that obstructs the execution of the law of the United States. And again, has to be a pretty high bar there. Some legal opinions that have come out since have determined that basically you have to be in a situation where the state is either unwilling or unable to enforce its own law or is refusing to abide by federal court orders. So if a state is sort of standing up to the federal government and saying, no, we don't care about your federal policies, we don't care about your laws, we're going to actively intervene to try to prevent them from being enforced, that's a situation where you could have an Insurrection Act declaration. It has been used in the past, and a couple of these instances where you see federal-state conflicts took place during the 50s and 60s. So, for instance, Dwight Eisenhower used the Insurrection Act in the desegregation of Little Rock High School, but what he used it for was to tell the Arkansas National Guard to stand down. So they had been activated in an attempt to thwart desegregation, and Eisenhower used the Insurrection Act to tell them, no, you cannot do that. Kennedy likewise ordered the Alabama National Guard to stand down a couple of times, and Johnson used it to suppress civil unrest and riots, often upon the invitation of state governors, especially in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King. Reagan used it to suppress a prison riot. And the most recent examples we have were George H.W. Bush, using it twice, the most notable example being during the Rodney King unrest in Los Angeles. So this is the kind of uncertain legal ground that the Trump administration stands on in trying to bring federal military assistance to ICE and Border Patrol. And at this point, there are two cases, one a district court ruling and one a ruling from the US Supreme Court, suggesting that this is going to be tough to sustain. In Newsom versus Trump, this bounced around at the Ninth Circuit for a while, but we now have an order on the ground that prohibits the direct use of troops in California under the Posse Comitatus Act. And then in Trump versus Illinois, the US Supreme Court actually waded into the fray. Trump had, as I mentioned, nationalized the federal guard to protect federal personnel and property in Chicago. When he did this, he did not use the Insurrection Act. He used a different statute which authorizes the president to call up the National Guard under certain limited circumstances. But the court found that the administration had not shown that it could legally use the military to address this unrest, which prevented the administration from federalizing the National Guard basically to achieve the same objective. So that's kind of where we stand right now. Obviously, there are some very significant legal debates going on about the way that ICE is exercising its authority. There will be challenges at the federal level to trying to hold individual ICE agents accountable for perceived violations of the law. But there are likely to be attempts to hold them accountable on the state level, which will open up additional legal complications and debates. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Rob Worden, who'll give you a much more grounded perspective on what's going
on. Thank you, Julie, but I'm not sure I'm going to do that, but I'll let you all judge. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us. I studied policing, but I hasten to add I am no expert on federal law enforcement. Most research on policing and law enforcement is done on the local and to a lesser extent state level, where most policing and law enforcement is done. There is, to my knowledge, hardly any systematic inquiry on federal law enforcement. But in the hopes that we might better understand the events in Minneapolis, we can apply a framework that has been useful in analyzing adverse outcomes in various settings, and they're called sentinel event reviews. A sentinel event is a negative outcome that signals underlying weaknesses in a system or a process, is likely the product or result of compound errors, and may, if properly understood, provide important keys to strengthening the system and preventing similar outcomes in the future. Sentinel event reviews were initially developed as a process for better understanding the causes of industrial accidents. They were later adapted to aviation, as in investigations of aircraft crashes and near misses, with which I'm sure we're all familiar with the NTSB, and to medical environments, where they are sometimes known as mortality reviews. They were first used in criminal justice with respect to wrongful convictions, but generally, given an unwanted outcome, someone dies on the operating table or someone is convicted and punished for a crime that she didn't commit, the analysis examines the process that produced the outcome and asks where things went awry and what systematic factors contributed to things going awry. And the intent is to examine events with a view toward procedural changes that promise to reduce the likelihood of such outcomes in the future. It generally de-emphasizes blame, though as NTSB reports sometimes illustrate, there's certainly room for the allocation of blame. And we can treat as sentinel events the fatal shootings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. I would not purport to offer a definitive judgment, but they appear to be of dubious legality. If the shooting of Renee Good was not a crime, it was surely what some people would characterize as lawful but awful. But beyond individual culpability, we can consider other factors that potentially contributed to those outcomes. So I'll tick off a few, and some of these reiterate points that Julie made. ICE and Border Patrol personnel were performing a function, protest policing, in an urban environment for which they are arguably not well prepared. They are executing an enforcement strategy, call it a crackdown, if you will, as the administration has, but it also resembles what has sometimes been called a scorched earth strategy. DHS has concentrated enforcement in selected cities, as Julie recounted. By one count, 3,000 officers in Minneapolis. That's 5 times as many officers as the city's police department employs. They are expected to meet arrest quotas, which generate eye-popping numbers, but not scrupulous adherence to the rule of law. They're allowed to wear masks, and if body cameras are thought to promote civil behavior between officers and civilians, we might speculate that masks would do the opposite. ICE and CPB have struck a rather permissive managerial posture on procedural violations. Agency directives have authorized its agents to enter private residences forcibly without a judicial warrant, which, as Julie mentions, is required. In September, the Supreme Court decided that immigration officers could use race and ethnicity as factors in determining who to stop, which it appears opened the door to arrests of people with no criminal history. By one account, across the surges in LA, DC, and Illinois, about 70% of the people arrested had no prior criminal conviction, and not even for minor violations. Across the rest of the country, the figure is about 33%. Media reports depict a hiring process that compromises standards in the interest of filling positions quickly. Training for newly hired officers has been cut back to 47 days. I'll let you ponder the number 47 if you'd like. The strategic goal is purportedly public safety with a claim to focus on the worst of the worst. It's contradicted by the data. Is it political theater? Is it meat for the base? Is it part of a push toward authoritarianism? You can subscribe to any of those, but at a minimum, it would appear to be a recipe for calamity, arguably, and certainly from my perspective, a discredit to American law enforcement. ICE looks like a caricature of US policing that the most ardent critics of police would draw. These operations conflict with local goals of public trust and cooperation, including the cooperation of legal and illegal immigrants, and that's raised alarms among city police executives. 10 days ago, the International Association of Chiefs of Police put out a carefully worded statement, and I'd just like to read a little bit of that to you. The IACP emphasizes that effective public safety depends on comprehensive training, investigative integrity, adherence to the rule of law, and strong coordination among federal, state, and local partners. In times of uncertainty, officials at all levels play a critical role in de-escalating tensions by using measured, responsible rhetoric that reinforces lawful processes and public trust rather than deepening division. The IACP urges leaders and stakeholders to support calm, lawful engagement in policies grounded in proven practice that strengthen accountability while preserving the capacity of law enforcement agencies to coordinate effectively and protect communities. There's more, but I'll spare you reading between the lines, it seems to me, I can imagine the processes at IACP that produced that statement. Reading between the lines, it says, what the hell is going on? Now, police work is marked by normative complexity. Social values that policing serves are not all mutually compatible. Strategic and tactical choices need to take account of value conflicts, and to do so with the judicious exercise of authority. Now, I'm almost done, I promise. Many years ago, Mark Moore proposed that we think of police authority as a resource to be expended judiciously in achieving social ends. Crime reduction and order maintenance can be treated, according to Moore's framework, as benefits or revenue in the police ledger, and the use of authority as a cost incurred, and efficiency turns on the ratio of benefits to costs. And he argues police should be mindful of those costs. We haven't seen that with the push to enforce immigration laws or the response to protest, which, as Julie mentioned, has been marked by the liberal use of pepper spray and tear gas against nonviolent protesters, hardly efficient in this sense. Now, a recent report by the New York Times and a press conference involving Tom Homan indicates that the strategy has shifted, focusing more on genuine public safety threats, and that could be an important change, but it's in the context of a whole host of other factors that have their own likely effects. With that, I'll shut up and leave the floor to all of you.
Thank you so much. I see we've got some questions in the chat. We also have a couple of questions that came in previously. There's two that came in before the event that I think probably kind of go together. One is, how do we decipher what's real in the media? And related, incidents like these serve like a political Rorschach test, so people see what they expect to see. How can we have conversations about the nuances of these situations if people have already made their minds up about what happened before we know any of the facts? Do you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I guess I can. I don't know how far I can get. The events, even those that are captured by cell phone videos, are to some degree ambiguous, and maybe intrinsically so. The shooting of Renee Good, whether the officer was in fear of his life, whether the officer may have placed himself at risk and in that way contributed to an event that he needed to respond to. I think those are by nature to some extent ambiguous and certainly open to different interpretations. What I've seen of the video of the shooting of Alex Preddy allows for less interpretation, less ambiguity, I think, in that instance. Most of the country supports the enforcement of immigration laws. That as an end would seem to be, if not consensual, at least a subject of widespread agreement. The real ambiguous and potentially contentious issue is how to enforce immigration laws, and whether the strategy that the administration has been pursuing is one that actually contributes to public safety. That's my best crack, Julie.
No, I think that helps a lot. I mean, it's really challenging when you're in the situation where things are unfolding on the ground and the public is in this position of trying to adjudicate what happened and often seeing what is happening through their own political lenses. What I would say from the Law and Society perspective is that if you don't trust an institution to be accountable, if you don't trust an institution to check itself, that's going to contribute to a situation where people are going to be more likely to want to exercise their own independent judgment about what happened. So in this politically charged environment, and in light of some of the things that have happened in the last several months, there is a lot of distrust in the ability of the administration to identify and rectify things that have gone wrong. And unfortunately, in these instances, the immediate reaction of saying that nothing wrong had happened without conducting any investigation is, I think, something that pretty much any police department would know was a pretty serious misstep, both as a matter of justice and as a matter of maintaining public trust. Let's see if we can find one from the chat. Where did Bovino fit in? He was put in charge of these operations, and there's some suggestion that he was responsible for some of the more aggressive posture that we have seen from ICE. He was in charge of the ICE operations. And he really quickly became the target for a lot of the negative response to what was happening in Minneapolis in particular, and that led to him withdrawn and re-diverted. It's not exactly clear, as far as I know, what his status is currently, but he is no longer the face of any of these operations, largely, I think, for political reasons. But he did have a background in immigration enforcement before this. Are these ICE agents coming from the domestic militia, been followed by the FBI since the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building? I don't know. I think it's very hard to tell. There was an interesting story a couple of weeks ago about someone, a journalist, who applied to be an ICE agent just to see what would happen. And to this journalist's surprise, it wasn't that, oh, they're going out and finding really terrible people and hiring them. The surprise was that there didn't really seem to be much concern. They're just trying to get people into position and not really asking a lot of questions about their background or their motivations. So, you know, it is possible that there are some people doing this work who, under ordinary circumstances, would probably find it hard to get a position in the federal government. Okay, this might be a good one for you to take a crack at, Rob. I can try as well. How do we evaluate the argument that much of the disruption is a result of lack of cooperation with ICE by local authorities?
You know, local authorities have cooperated to a degree, historically and more recently. I understand, for example, the Minnesota Department of Corrections cooperates with ICE around the release of inmates who are in the country illegally. But I think you're speaking more about local police departments, some of which have drawn a line at cooperating with ICE and performing immigration enforcement more generally. And I'm skeptical that it's contributed to the clashes that we've seen in Minneapolis and elsewhere. The locals would argue that they are being mindful of their role in ensuring the safety of their entire citizenry, that they need to enjoy the trust of immigrant communities so that crimes and disorders are reported to them so that they can respond, investigate as needed, obtain information for those investigations from people in those communities. That and that's I think an arguably reasonable posture for them to strike. Their reticence about cooperating has historically not created the kinds of clashes that have been associated with these crackdowns in the last several months.
There's also an important federalism background that I think we should keep in mind here. This goes back to the 1990s when the Supreme Court was largely responsible for revitalizing federalism and making it clear that states and localities have a range of choices that they can make to collaborate very actively with the federal government, or to choose not to collaborate with the federal government if the federal government is not providing the resources and this is not taking place under the direct command of the federal government. So under Prince versus United States, you can't, according to that case itself, commandeer local law enforcement to carry out a federal agenda that isn't integrated with the resources to support that. Some localities will likely push this, and some states are likely to push this as well. And at some point, we are likely to see some pretty significant tensions arising around how far a state can go if it wants to go beyond just not cooperating with some sort of federal agenda to kind of actively throwing sand in the gears. And that would get us into kind of a different space. We have a question here referring to an editorial that Representative Tonko published in the Times-Union calling for the abolition of ICE. Do we think that this is likely to be a standard that the Democratic Party would carry forward in 2028? Or do we think that the pendulum is likely to swing back from this moment that we're experiencing right now, and the call would be more likely just for a much more modest program of reform of immigration?
I would think that a moderate position would be to the reform agenda that they've initiated, and also should the Democratic Party achieve more control 2028, I'd certainly like to see resources devoted to ICE curtailed, reallocated, perhaps. There are greater needs in other enforcement areas than in immigration enforcement, in my humble estimation. But the abolition of ICE, I don't think would be politically prudent, nor do I think it's necessary.
I would just note that it's been kind of remarkable to watch the public opinion shift with regard to immigration that has taken place over the last year or so. When Trump took office, there was a great deal of enthusiasm for very rigorous enforcement of immigration laws. And now we are seeing a lot of that really strong support has evaporated. Now, it remains to be seen where things are going to go over the next couple of years, but it is certainly possible that if there's a shift in partisan control of the government in 2028, that at the very least, there will be some significant political energy behind reforming the way that the immigration system is managed and the way that immigration enforcement operates on the ground. We have a question about due process for those who are detained by ICE. One thing I would note about our immigration system is that not every due process guarantee that applies to citizens applies in the immigration enforcement context. Orders of removal can be instituted by immigration judges relatively quickly. Immigration judges themselves are not Article III judges who are nominated by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. They are creatures of the administrative state. But even given that, it seems that some of the things that are happening push against even the fairly modest protections that are in the administrative rules and in congressional legislation. And we're seeing, it's going to be a while before we have any definitive answers on many of these questions. As you may recall, early in the Trump administration, there were challenges to some orders of removal, challenges to things like the blanket withdrawal of a temporary protective status from large groups of immigrants, changes to the asylum system. And a lot of these challenges are continuing to work their ways through the federal courts. And there were some preliminary orders. Some of them ended up getting reversed by the Supreme Court on a preliminary basis. But all this is just going to take some time for the courts to sort out. What kind of legal precedent is there for the state federal authority in investigation of the killing of Good and Pretty?
Yeah, normally these would be concurrent investigations. And on the federal level, my understanding is that the FBI would normally do the investigation, not DHS. But I'm not the legal expert between us, so Julie, I'll defer to you on legalities.
That's my understanding as well. Again, you have a federal agent operating in under the color of employment by a federal agency. So ordinarily, one would expect the FBI to take the lead on this. So in a way, it's almost a mirror of what we saw in the passage of the 14th Amendment, which basically set out this legal framework where, all right, we're going to extend this full package of civil rights to everybody. And the states are going to be responsible for enforcing civil rights. But we, the federal government, are going to stand in the background. And if the state interferes with people's civil rights actively or neglects to enforce civil rights, then we, the feds, will come in and provide access to civil rights enforcement. In this case, it's the feds who are kind of standing back, and people are calling on state officials to come in and kind of correct for what they perceive as federal neglect. So again, this is going to take some time to unwind and for everything to play out. Initially, as we've mentioned, there was not going to be any investigation at all. Now the federal government is backtracking. They're saying there is going to be some form of investigation. Will that ultimately be satisfying? Not clear. Here's an interesting question. Would you expect the images from Minneapolis to negatively impact legitimacy in other police agencies in the United States?
Yeah, that's certainly conceivable. That members of the public would paint law enforcement with a very broad brush and not differentiate among agencies very much. So that's plausible. Now, one I read recently a brief piece by a former police chief who's now in academia, who cast ICE as a terrific foil for local law enforcement that contrast us, please, with the performance you've seen from ICE, and added that they have an opportunity, since the Trump administration has backed away from the investigation of state or local agencies for a pattern or practice of civil rights investigations. The argument was that now it's clear that whatever local agencies do to foster public trust, to be more transparent, to be more accountable, they are doing of their own volition and not because they're being coerced to do so. I'm not quite as optimistic as the author about the success with which agencies can capitalize on this if it's an opportunity, but that was one point of view anyway.
Okay, we have two questions about reforms that are either have been announced or are being advanced. One about ICE agents wearing masks. Is it legal for them to wear masks? And what do we think of NOM's recent announcement that ICE and CBP agents are going to be required to wear body cameras?
I can certainly address the body camera question. Deploying body cameras is one thing. The policy governing their use is a distinct matter, and the extent to which officers comply with said policy is still another. And so I think that there's certainly political symbolism that's surely intended in that announcement, but in the end, what, if any, effect that has on actual behavior and not just on public perception will turn on how the activation of body cameras is governed and officers' compliance with those regulations. So, yeah, time will tell, I suppose.
And in terms of ICE agents wearing masks, I don't know for sure. I don't think there's any federal law requiring agents of the federal government to present their identities in ways that are accessible to the public. But certainly this has become a political flashpoint, and it's been something that has really captured the attention of the public as something that they can really hold on to. As we know, the folks justifying this policy have claimed that it is in attempt to prevent these officers from being harassed or injured. There is not a lot of evidence that any significant injuries or harms have taken place to ICE agents who've been identified. I would expect that there'll be a lot of pressure for changing that policy in the near future. Many are drawing parallels between what is happening in Minnesota and what began in Nazi Germany early on, foreshadowing out of control authoritarianism. Your review.
Yeah, I read an editorial, I think it was just yesterday or the day before, that advanced that argument. And at this point, I honestly don't know what to think of it. It frightens me. There do appear to be parallels, undeniable parallels. And so I wouldn't venture to guess at this point, but certainly food for thought.
I think it is, again, an interesting comparison. Because I am, as I like to describe myself, a narrow Americanist, I tend to look back into American history for lessons and for potential parallels. And some of what I see has me thinking about things that were happening in the late 19th century as the United States was moving on toward a system in which white supremacist state structures were permitted to operate in several southern states with no concern by the federal government. You did see political repression beginning to ramp up more and more seriously. You saw violence being exercised against individuals who were engaging in political action. Some of that was state violence. Some of it was extra state violence that was not pursued or punished by the state. For a while, the federal government was interested in intervening in this process, but then stepped back. And folks in the South who wanted to maintain a democratic form of government were left on their own to try to defend it. And ultimately, they were not able to defend it. So if you look to the state of Alabama, Plessy versus Ferguson was decided in 1896. In 1901, the state of Alabama held a constitutional convention, the explicit aim of which was to create a legitimate white supremacist state. At that time, there were still over 200,000 African Americans registered to vote in the state of Alabama. But by 1905 or so, there were only 2,000, or I think about 5,000 left. So can this sort of thing happen in the United States? As unthinkable as it may seem to be, there are forms in which it has happened in the United States. The more hopeful lesson that you might take from that history is that through relentless organization and pressure, through collaboration between grassroots organizations and elites, through partnerships and activism, that white supremacist state was eventually dismantled. Yeah, the Nazis did certainly learn a lot from looking at the way that Jim Crow was implemented and some of the racially eugenicist theories that undergirded that system. We probably do have time for one or maybe two more questions if people have them. And I know it is an uncertain moment now, hard to tell exactly where all of this is going. Hard to know actually even where we are right now with some of the rhetoric from the federal government suggesting that the temperature is turning down, while people on the scene are saying that no, there's still a lot of violence taking place on the ground. I would also note that there seems to be an intent to move this system of enforcement aggressively into the state of Ohio, which is home to many folks from Haiti. So that will certainly be something to watch over the next several weeks. Seems that the people of Minnesota are being pretty heroic. It is interesting to note that through all of this, through the many people who have been out in Minnesota and engaged in these actions, we have seen really many of them focusing on documenting what is going on and then being met with these forms of state violence, which again has its echoes in American history. Professor Worden, any last thoughts?
No, I think I've done my damage, Julie. Thanks, though.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining me. We very much appreciate you spending a little time with us here today. I apologize for my ineptness with Zoom. Yeah, great book, Illiberal America. But I would ask you just to keep an eye out. We will continue to have sessions and we will send out information about upcoming events soon. And thank you so much. We appreciate you spending some time with us today.